This whole process was horrific. I had already gone a year before signing the NDA and had refused to sign. The second time I went, I had no support, no legal representation, and faced an adjudicator who made disparaging comments about my motivation and pressured me to sign.
The company, the union, and I met for what I thought was arbitration, but when we gathered, the arbitration never started. I said no to mediation and no to an NDA for more than 8 hours. After 9.5 hours, I was broken. I wanted to go home. I was hungry. I was tired. I was traumatized. So I signed the NDA.
I agreed to hide a part of myself that needs to be healed. I live small because I feel I am not worth justice.
I was not given any time to negotiate the NDA. My PTSD became worse. I experienced anxiety and made 2 suicide attempts. I never returned to full-time employment, and my 10-plus year career as a skilled tradeswoman ended.
I tried to break my way out of the NDA. I thought if I break it before I'm even given any money, then I just won't receive the money, and that will be that. I didn't care about the money, but the NDA made me feel dirty and gross. The day the NDA was foisted on me, it felt like non-consensual sex. It felt like an assault. I felt violated. I felt like the NDA covered me in filth, and I wanted desperately to get it off of me.
Why does the legal system and many of our institutions continue to be so ignorant? The answer is simple. It's because they continue to protect abusers. I don't need to prove abusers are protected. In fact, I have physical evidence in the form of my non-disclosure agreement from 1997. A quarter century later, I still can't speak a great deal of truth about my own childhood.
As a Black woman, I had relinquished the right to speak my truth, to reach out to and support other Black employees who were experiencing the same racist treatment that I faced. After I signed the NDA, I overdosed. After that, the world felt like a darker and more cynical place.
I refused the settlement offer and insisted on going to arbitration. Partway through that process, and more than a year after my termination, I was again offered an agreement which I insisted I did not want for fear of the consequences. The agreement included an NDA and financial compensation. Over several weeks, my union rep and their lawyer repeatedly pressured me to accept and sign that agreement, suggesting the grievances could be withdrawn if I didn't. The lawyers and the union rep controlled the entire thing.
From my perspective, it was a tactic to get me to quit. I regret not seeking legal advice earlier. I was on the brink of an emotional breakdown, and I knew I had to get my life back on track. I gave in and signed the NDA. Looking back, I regret it. I wasn't in the proper state of mind to make such an important decision.
The next day, I asked to be released. I said they knew I didn't want an NDA, that I had said no enough times, and that I was pressured into signing it. I was not released.
I was asked to sign an NDA to settle a sexual harassment complaint in my workplace. I didn't have a choice. The terms were presented to me and I wasn't allowed to change them. I needed the financial settlement because I'd lost my job due to discrimination, so I felt I had to sign.
Signing it caused me mental health issues and made me feel like I didn't matter. I struggled starting new employment as I have to lie a lot about the past employer.
Having to sign an NDA was the first time I felt helpless, hopeless, and powerless. It was a feeling worse for me than the 1.5 years of sexual harassment I endured from my employer. I lost my job, I lost my voice, I became jaded and distrustful of all people in positions of power.
Universities that use NDAs to silence victims of sexual harassment only care about protecting their reputation and assets. He was the dean and is still a tenured professor. Most importantly, I learned that I don't matter.
I felt silenced, disempowered, and swept under the rug by the first NDA I signed. When I chose voice and refused to sign an NDA in the second situation, it meant further public attacks on my credibility. The confidentiality agreement still hangs over my head as a threat. NDAs are still seen as normal trade-off by lawyers.
I am a survivor of childhood physical and sexual abuse. After running away at 14 and not returning, I lived my life alone. Everyone knows about the abuse. It was only me who did not agree to forget about it. I'm not allowing this to go quietly into the archives. Canadian law is going to have to fix this one. My case is still before the courts. I would love to be the first person released from the NDA in Canada.
Hi, everybody. I can't see you now, but I guess you can see me. When I listen to those stories, which are all taken from our testimonies, which people have submitted to Can't Buy My Silence and are on the website, we very carefully anonymize those stories so that no one is in any legal danger. When I hear those stories read aloud like that, I have to say it sends shudders down my spine, because I think that even just from the little bit that you've heard, and if you look at the website, you'll see there are more than 80 stories, and these were just snippets. You'll see that the stories are horribly consistent. They really follow the same pattern of, I was pressured, I didn't understand, I didn't know what this was going to mean for me going forward. I was told I couldn't get any money unless I signed. The same refrain over and over and over again. And we wanted to begin with those words because I think that's where we need to locate our conversation once we've watched the movie She Said. You're going to find the movie very engaging, and it has really done an amazing job of bringing to people's attention just how awful and odious NDAs are, because they protect wrongdoers like Harvey Weinstein. But this is also about every one of us and your friends and your neighbors and the many people who will be in your circle somewhere, amongst whom will be at least a couple of people who've signed NDAs. The person who put that amazing audio together for us is also nameless, because she is also in legal action at the moment. But I just want to say that we are incredibly thankful to her. So Can't Buy My Silence came about when Zelda and I met for the first time at the very beginning of 2021. Zelda had already been working for some years on this issue, and I had just left my university position in disgust at my university's use of NDAs. We both have, obviously, therefore, personal experience that is motivating our work in this area. Zelda, as you will see in the movie, because her story is in part told in this movie, she's played by Sam Morton. Zelda publicly broke her NDA with Harvey Weinstein almost 20 years later. And she was the first woman to publicly break her NDA. And she began a conversation that is still continuing and getting louder and louder now about the abusive misuse of NDAs, which were originally supposed to be protecting trade secrets. But now every kind of misconduct, every kind of ugly event that takes place in a workplace is apparently a trade secret. I had my own experience. I discovered that one of my colleagues at the University of Windsor Faculty of Law, who had been terminated for harassment and abuse of students, was had in fact been given a non-disclosure agreement and was now seeking work in other institutions. How did I know that? Because I started getting phone calls from people saying, why did this guy leave? And the penny dropped. That set off a chain of events, because obviously I told the truth, a chain of events that, just like with Zelda, completely imploded my life. And so we are very connected in our joint passion for getting this problem fixed. And I am very optimistic now. We have seen incredible progress in the last 15, 16 months since we launched the campaign, and we're hoping to see a lot more to come. So just a quick clarification. Zelda is not on the panel. It's the middle of the night in the United Kingdom, but she has recorded a message for you. And so I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce my partner and my dear friend, Zelda Perkins.
Hi, I'm Zelda Perkins. I'd like to thank each of you for coming out on International Women's Day to this special Vancouver screening of She Said, in aid of Can't Buy My Silence. When I broke my non-disclosure agreement in 2017, as depicted in the film, I did it in the hope that the system that protects abusers would be revealed to the world and change would ensue. This was 5 years ago. There's been much conversation and some change. Weinstein is indeed in jail, but the truth is that NDAs are still being used every day to silence the voices of victims by those more powerful than themselves, and abusers are continuing to act with impunity because of a legal tool. Julie McFarlane and I co-founded Can't Buy My Silence because we're both passionate about changing the laws that govern how NDAs are used around the world, and making sure that no one else has to suffer as we have. In just over a year, we've made incredible progress in Canada, Ireland, Australia, and the UK, with new legislation driven by our campaign being passed in Prince Edward Island, Ontario, and the UK. But there's much work still to be done, and we need your help to keep going. Literally, we're wearing ourselves and our volunteers out. Financial help is crucial, so please use the QR code on screen. But for those who can't contribute, understanding the issue and spreading the word is also key to making change. She Said may be a dramatic film, but I can assure you that the consequences of what happened were very real and very painful for myself and many others. And these consequences are still alive for many. The film's created an opportunity to amplify this serious issue and I hope ignite faster change around the world so that NDAs can no longer be used to protect bullies, abusers and sexual predators. I'm so grateful for the support of Universal Pictures and the producers and cast of She Said in their commitment to using the film as not just a cautionary tale from the past, but as an instrument of change for the future. And that's why we're here this afternoon. There's still a lot to talk about, so I hope you'll stay after the film for the brilliant panel led by my partner, Julie McFarlane.
I just wanted to hoot all through that movie. Woo! Didn't you? Like, yes, go! Get him! Sorry.
It is a
I had to let that out.
powerful movie, though. I understand, and it's always very interesting trying to watch a movie like that and then come into a discussion like this. But I'm really, really pleased to be here today. My name is Joanne Stark, and I'm pleased to be moderating today's panel discussion. Just a note for those of you in the audience that are with the Law Society of British Columbia, registered there, you can claim CPD hours for this event, so please do. If you're, there we go. Woohoo, there's the woohoo! Woohoo!
We were quite surprised too, but they said yes.
They said yes, and I believe it's for 3.5 hours. Is that correct? Yes.
3.5 hours.
Yay! So there you go. You get a little bonus there. So it's all good, all good. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of a survey here with everyone here. I don't know about all of you, but I grew up in the youngest of a family of 5, and I had an older sibling who used to like to pick on me a bit, and he'd poke me in the back seat of the car all the time, or he'd steal things away from me. And when I was a little girl, I used to report the wrongdoing, and I'd come forward and complain to my mom and say, he's doing it again, make him stop. And at some point, she started to change her message to me, and it became, no one likes a tattletale. Stop being a tattletale. And then I started hearing messages like, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all. And those are some of the messages that I had growing up, which I actually carried into my adult life. And I didn't really realize it at the time. I thought she was just trying to get us to calm down. And I'm just wondering, with a show of hands in the audience here today, how many of you had messages like that growing up? Yeah, oh my gosh. Yeah, that's me. Yeah. And I mean, it's not intentional. I think that it's all meant to be very well and good. But in the end, sometimes that conditioning can really impact us. And we could see some of that perhaps happening in the movie as it played out. And before I have a seat, I do want to introduce the panel here today. So I have To my far left over there, I have Dr. Julie McFarlane. Dr. Julie McFarlane is, of course, the co-founder of Can't Buy My Silence that brought this event here today. And she is also the former distinguished professor of law at the University of Windsor and also a recipient of the Order of Canada. So we're very, very pleased to have her in Vancouver today. And she's done an amazing job with this initiative for sure. And next to Julie, we have Sonia Furstenau, who's the leader of the BC Green Party, and she is also an MLA at the Cowichan area. So thank you for being here today, Sonia. I'm just going to make sure I've got everything correct here. All right. And then, of course, I have Jennifer Kaur here, who's the supervising lawyer at the Community Legal Assistance Society's Sharp Workplace Legal Advisory Clinic. Sharp provides free legal advice to people in British Columbia who have experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. And she's also on the Uniform Law Commission for Uniform Law Conference for Canada. So, welcome to everyone here. All right. So, welcome everybody again for International Women's Day. And of course, we all live here in Canada, and we like to think that it's rather progressive here for women in Canada. It is, certainly, compared to some of the other countries like those in the Middle East, for example. And I want to acknowledge that when we have our discussion here today, that we will be including in that discussion cis women, trans people of all genders, and non-binary people, among others, in this context. So when I talk about the survey that we had, I'm just curious what others have to think about the way that young women and girls are still being conditioned, perhaps, to keep quiet when experiencing harassment or abuse. And what sort of culture shift do we need? I know that, Sonia, you have a daughter, right, that's in her teen years. So what sort of feelings do you have about that, about the way we condition our girls?
Yeah, and I'll start. My pronouns are she, her. And happy International Women's Day, everybody. Our daughter, we have a blended family. She's the youngest of 5. And I'm so grateful for her because she has this capacity to push back in a way that I think all young women and girls need to have. But she prefaces it, thankfully, so she gives us warning, especially with her dad. She says, dude. And then she drops some truth, right? And at our very best, we listen and hear. And the other weekend, last weekend, I was on the receiving end of this. And I just found myself listening and then agreeing and then thanking her for helping to make me a better parent. But it takes a lot, to not go against the conditioning of parenting, of being a daughter, of all of these things that are just so ingrained in us. Be nice. I'm always making a joke about myself at the legislature. Oh no, I'm the nice one, right? And I think being nice is really overrated. And what I loved about this film is that telling the truth and demanding the truth and reflecting back what is really happening is needed so much right now. And that's what I want my daughter to do. I also want my son to recognize he has a role to play. And so this generation has a lot to learn from all the mistakes of our generations and generations ahead of us. And they'll make their own mistakes, but hopefully they don't make the same mistakes we did.
Very good. Very good. I agree wholeheartedly. Julie, what about you? Do you have any comments or thoughts about the conditioning of girls?
I think that one of the things that I really notice the most about the conditioning still of young girls and women, and I have 3 daughters, and I'm their mother, but what I still see so pervasive that came out, I think, in this movie is a sense of shame that is associated with, to some extent, what you're talking about, Joanne, is that tattling is also shameful. Mm-hmm. But of course, there's a much deeper shame that's associated with talking about an assault that's been sexual or an harassment. And you saw that over and over again in the movie. And I wish I could say that I think that shame has been lifted from my daughters. And I'll give you another example that I was having a conversation with a very dear friend about last night. The shame of having had an abortion. Still not talked about. And I think that all of these things are so much part of our conditioning, and we need to start naming them. I mean, that's why part of the theme of this, if you look at this, as a macro theme, not just about NDAs, is about speaking up and naming it.
Very, very true. And when you talk about women and their experiences, I noticed in the movie, this is my third time seeing it, but I'm even more emotional watching it on the big screen. But, they bring in things like the experiences with breast cancer, with giving birth, with postpartum depression, with dealing with the family and trying to work while you're trying to also raise your children. It is a challenging thing for sure. Yes. And Jennifer, what are your thoughts about conditioning of boys and how boys are perceiving some of these things that we see?
Yes, I think in society, our society is patriarchal, so we do have this conditioning that happens and gender expectations of roles of boys and girls. And you can see the expectations and what's permissible for boys. And we can see in the news discussion about Andrew Tate and the influence that he's having on young men now. And those issues are really marked in terms of the effect that it has on women and girls as well. I think that also there's been a study recently, a few years ago, Angus Reid, right after Me Too, that actually found that young men now think that certain behaviors that we consider sexual harassment are okay in the workplace. So it found that young men versus men over 50 were half as likely to think of something as sexual harassment. So that included jokes in the workplace, standing too close to a woman, touching somebody's shoulders without permission, commenting on someone's body. All of that was found to be determined by these young men as less sexual harassment.
Thank you. Yes, I think there was more acceptable behavior to even try to pursue a relationship with a woman or, make comments about them, that sort of thing, which is kind of surprising when you think about, young men 18 to 35. You'd think that they'd be a lot more, aware of the negative impact, right, that it has on women. But again, sometimes we just have to be not so nice. Maybe we have to speak up and be a little bit more assertive, not necessarily aggressive, but assertive, right, and stand our ground and band together, right, as one. So in this movie, we see journalists carefully dancing around the issue about how to support women, and they eventually some of them do share their stories publicly, as we see near the end of the show. The comment was, if they all jump together. And I think that was a really powerful message, and that they could share their story if they were together. There's no doubt instances where there will be some brave women that will come forward. But there's other times where I've seen instances that some women will be quick to challenge that woman's perspective, and they might even distance themselves from the event. And we saw some of that happening in the movie. So I'm curious, how do we get people to stand together beside other women, instead of taking the other side? And how do we create a network where women are feeling more supported by other women? And I know that Sonia and I, we were talking on the weekend about some of the things that went on in the legislature with women in their clothing. Maybe you could comment on that, about women standing together.
Yeah, I have a couple stories about the legislature. One, first time I ever stood up in question period back in 2017, brand new MLA, this is, And there'd been some discourse back and forth between the official opposition and the NDP government around the most important legislation that had ever been presented in the BC legislature. And the NDP were saying, well, it's the legislation to ban big money that got in 2017. That was good legislation. I'm very pleased about that. But the then interim leader of the official opposition, Rich Coleman, was saying, no, it was the legislation that allowed women to vote 100 years ago. And I thought, it's a little challenging for me to see Rich Coleman present himself as a feminist in this discourse. But our chief of staff at the time suggested to me that I just say what I was observing in question period. And I thought, okay, there can't be anything wrong with saying what you see, like Winnie the Pooh. And so I stood up first time and I say, Honorable Speaker, I just want to comment on what I'm observing here, which is women being shouted down while they're trying to do their jobs. And the legislature erupted into this, like, it was, everybody started shouting, and the speaker told me to sit down. I'm like, uh-oh. And I had no idea that this was going to happen. And then out of that came members of the Liberal caucus saying to me, I degraded all women by suggesting that women couldn't make it in the man's world that is the BC legislature, to which I responded, I didn't degrade women, but I'm not here to make it in a man's world. Like, aren't we here to make this into a world for everybody, including women? And then I got a letter signed by all the women in the BC Liberal caucus reiterating this. And that put me into a fetal position, crying at the end of the day in my office and feeling shame. Yeah. And I've only started talking about this now in the wake of Melanie Mark's resignation 2 weeks ago, because I think it's really important that it be talked about. And I have then, from that moment, and many other moments in the legislature, been determined to make structural change. So one of the things that I'm so proud of, starting in 2017, I was House Leader, I was on the committee that works on the legislature. I've championed respectful workplace policy in the BC legislature, which did not exist until 2021. It took 4 years. Yeah, and I'm really proud of it. And eventually bringing on Mary Polak was the House Leader for the BC Liberals, and she and I worked on this together. I have developed excellent friendships with women in that House, in both sides of the House. And I really believe we can operate the way that women operate, the way we saw in that film. And all of us who work with other women know that that's exactly how it looks. All the hugging and the crying and the swearing and all the things. That's what it feels like. And we have a long ways to go, but that was a structural change. And what came with it, which is so important to your point, was that now there is training. Now there is a training session for everybody in the legislature about what it means to be in a respectful workplace, what is and is not harassment or bullying or inappropriately sexual behavior. And so there's no excuse because everybody gets the training. But there is also a process for dealing with these incidents, which are hopefully diminishing.
That's an amazing step forward. Thank you for doing that and for sharing that story. Jennifer, you obviously get a lot of stories like this. How prevalent is this in your job? How often do you hear about these kinds of complaints?
Well, I think that this is all the work that we do, so we do hear about it a lot. I do think the challenge is people feeling that shame that we're talking about and feeling comfortable talking and coming forward. We get calls. Angela's our intake person who's over there. And sometimes people feel really nervous about coming forward and not comfortable. And I want, if anybody's listening and considering or having a problem, to know that everything you say is confidential and people should feel comfortable coming forward, and we try to empower people to make the choice that's best for them. So if you choose an option or not choose an option, that's what's important. Going on Sonia's point, I think that it's really, in terms of creating an environment, is looking at building a network where you're supported, both in your organization and outside your organization, and for everybody to really challenge what the expectations are of people. In law, there's this expectation as a litigator that you're really aggressive and strong. And, as a small Chinese woman with a high-pitched voice, it's, not the the picture. So, but everybody finds their own way and how they can advocate or do their role. And I think everyone has the responsibility to try and create that space.
It's wonderful, yes. And in fact, I even was on a Facebook page this week, and someone was saying that they were getting harassed publicly on a social media about a contract they were working on, and I referred them over to your legal clinic because I just feel like it is something that is happening a lot, but we don't necessarily all hear about it, right? Because of that issue of shame and the misplaced shame. I really think the shame belongs with the person perpetrating the wrongdoing, and we need to start moving and shifting that shame over. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about non-disclosure agreements. And so we heard a lot in the movie about non-disclosure agreements and the impact of those and how they were originally designed as a way to protect trade secrets, but have basically been morphed into something to gag and silence people who are victimized. And so what I want to do is talk a little bit more about what changes we need to see happen with non-disclosure agreements and to try to stop these things from systematically happening. So I'm going to ask from each person's perspective, and Julie, I'm going to start with you. From an advocate's position, what can people do to help grassroots initiatives like Count By My Silence and others who are advocating against the misuse of NDAs? And I know we have lots of swag out in the hallway, so I encourage everybody to buy some of that to get the word out. But what other things can people be doing?
Well, I think that one of the things that Zelda and I realized right at the very beginning that we needed to do was to create a much stronger public awareness of just how pervasive NDAs are, because we've been looking here in this particular case at NDAs being used to silence people who've experienced rape and sexual harassment, but they're being used in so many contexts that I think many people don't understand because people don't speak about them. And they don't speak about them because they're gagged and they're afraid of speaking up about what happened to them. So, for example, we know that they're really widely used in cases of racial discrimination, where people make complaints about racial discrimination and anti-Indigenous racism, termination, NDA. We know that they're used very, very frequently in pregnancy discrimination, where women have not been given their entitlements under the law. They are terminated and given a sum of money to go away. And we also know that this is happening in things like consumer disputes. We're hiding defective products. This is actually happening in NDAs. Tainted baby formula was originally hidden in NDAs. We know that this is happening with service provision. Lots of service providers now, from financial planners through to real estate agents, include a clause in their agreement to say, you cannot complain about me or speak about anything that you think wasn't good about this. In other words, the regulators are being pulled out of this. There's a detour around the regulator, and there's so much, because they're secret settlements, there's so much lack of knowledge about this. So one of the things that this conversation you just had reminded me of the very first time Zelda and I met face to face, because we worked together for months and months and months. I don't think we met for the first time until the launch of the campaign, which was 9 months after we first started planning. And by that point, we had spoken, almost on a daily basis, trying to get everything organized for this campaign. And Zelda said to me, I'm really tired of people telling me that I'm brave because I spoke up. And I said, God, yes, that really gets on my nerves as well. And she said, it should just be normal. What you and I did should just be normal. And that, I think, is a huge part of what we need to take as the message of this campaign to people. Understand, inform yourself. These are all around you. You will know people who've signed NDAs. But let's get away from this idea that it's just the exceptional people who speak up, because it can be everybody. And believe me, we have this fantasy, myself and Zelda, of National Tear Up Your NDA Day, where everybody will go out onto the street and rip up their NDAs and jump up and down on them. And I think it's getting closer. And what you can do to help is to get the word out. Talk about this with your friends and your family members. You will find somewhere in that group someone has signed an NDA. The numbers in the US now are 1 in 3. And those are not all trade secret NDAs, believe me. These are mostly people in low-income, insecure sectors. And show them the website, and then keep finding out more. Keep promoting what you're learning about to other people, and write to your MLAs. Write to your MLAs and say, this is enough. This is totally bonkers. We need this to be over with, because that's what's starting to really change things in Canada now.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that. So I encourage everyone to get involved and also even to volunteer or share stories on the website on Can't
Yes,
Buy My
by the
Silence.
way, that's right. Thank you, Joanne.
Yeah.
The testimonies that you heard quotes from, they are used so often for media stories. They're really important. If you have a story, we will protect you. We do this very, very carefully. We go through the whole story several times to make sure there's nothing that can identify someone. So please think about that too. Thanks.
Yeah.
And just to also to comment, like it's really important to fill out the survey so we have data on the numbers of NDAs that are out there, because that's always the question that we're asked: how big of a problem is that when we're talking to the government about trying to introduce legislation and change it? So really encourage anybody to fill out the survey, provide a testimony, and encourage other people you know to do so.
And on that note, Jennifer, my question for you, excuse me, from a lawyer's perspective, is what sort of changes do we need to see in the legal profession? Because there was a lot of talk about that in the movie, that lawyers were basically the ones that were sort of blocking a lot of the discussion that the journalists were trying to get to. And a little bit about, if you could mention about lawyers having an ethical duty, whether it's to protect the victims of harassment or abuse, or whether it's to protect the organizations where they've been accused, and what sort of things might be on the minds of some of the people that are in the legal profession on that.
Oh, I could talk about that for a long time. I think as it has become kind of an expectation, a boilerplate in releases and contracts, that's a real problem for the younger lawyers to know that that's not how things used to settle, right? It's not like harassment is a new thing. These types of cases settled all the time before with a regular confidentiality clause that protected the privacy of the complainant. Joanne has championed last month a fantastic resolution to the Canadian Bar Association, which passed overwhelmingly. I think there was a slide about that earlier, that 94% of the Canadian Bar Association membership voted for a resolution. And that just goes to show how the profession has recognized that it's a problem, and that the misuse of NDAs needs to stop, and that we need to look at providing legislation for it. I also think the profession is taking a more trauma-informed approach. There's a lot of talk about it. The Law Society our regulators, start encouraging us to think about how to provide legal advice in a trauma-informed way. And if we're doing that, what does that mean in terms of our duty to the complainant, even if we're on the other side, or our responsibility to our client if it's the employer? And I think that there is a ethical duty existing now for lawyers, because while we're supposed to advocate for the best, most vigorously for our client, we still have a duty to the administration of justice in ensuring public trust in the system. And I think that in a little bit, we've lost our way on the NDAs. So I think the CBA resolution recognizes that, and there's a lot that we can do individually when looking at clauses as lawyers. If your client's asking for one, think about if you really need one. Our experience is that clients who have a sexual harassment complaint, if they settle it with the employer, they don't want to ever talk about it again. And that's the worry of employers. So you don't really need an NDA. And I think on a complainant side, there's a lot of education that needs to be done with lawyers really understanding what the impact on a client is if they sign an NDA. And I think those testimonies at the beginning really convey what that means. And so there's a lot of education to be done as well.
Yeah, and I think you're right. The trauma-informed lawyering, that whole idea is gaining a lot of momentum, and just understanding things from the client's perspective, and just taking less of a business approach and more of a human approach, I think, to practicing law is really, really critical. So thank you for that. I'm going to turn it over to Sonia now. From a politician's perspective, is there anything that can be done, or what could we see happening?
Yeah, there's very specific things that can be done, and that comes down to structural change in legislation. So we, as Zelda mentioned ahead of the movie, PEI and Ontario have introduced legislation to prevent the misuse of NDAs, and I'm happy to let you know you're the first to know about First to Know. Plan. Tomorrow, I will be introducing legislation in the BC legislature to prevent the misuse. Yeah. So, finally, but we're not there yet. So it will be, and I really want to thank Julie and Zelda and Haley. May, if you can stand up and wave. Haley is our policy lead in my caucus office. A lot of those scenes felt like scenes from our work, especially looking over press releases. We're all staring at it. Are we ready? Are we ready? Haley's done enormous work on this, as well as legislative drafters in the BC legislature who've worked with us. And it's a private members bill. So we have a majority government. I'm a part of a 2-member caucus. So private members bills, unfortunately, in BC, very rarely see the light of day. However, you can help, and you can put pressure on all of your MLAs. This is something that I think we can all agree is necessary legislation. It's long overdue. I agree, finally. And it really has to be addressed at a structural and legal level. So we're going to get that ball moving tomorrow morning.
And we do have on our website a template letter to MLAs that's being used all over the country. So you can go find that and download it and, change a couple of words here and there.
Yeah. Can I just say about NDAs? And I think one of the things that really came out in the film is how isolating they are. I had to sign an NDA in 2017 when I was part of the crew that was negotiating the agreement between the Greens and ultimately the NDP. But we negotiated with both the Liberals and the NDP. So I was a brand new MLA, and I'm suddenly swept up into, we're negotiating the terms of what governing is going to look like for the next several years. And I had to sign an NDA, which meant I couldn't talk to my family. I couldn't talk to anybody of my peers. I couldn't talk to friends. I couldn't talk about this very strange world that I suddenly found myself immersed in. At one of the negotiating tables, there was Andrew Weaver, me, and Liz. We were the three on our side, and then it was Mike, and another guy that wasn't named Mike.
You just broke your NDA.
Oh, yeah, I believe me, all the NDAs got broken. But it was so isolating. And I remember I was back at my hotel one night after one of these sessions, and I was really distressed. And I phoned my friend Sonia, and her teenage son said, "Mom, go to her. She needs you right now. You could hear my voice." And we just went for a walk. And of course, I couldn't talk about anything. And then Norman Spector broke all the NDAs and talked about everything that happened. So it was nonsense. But it was isolating. And it is, I think, really important that we recognize that these are so overused and that they are harmful to the people that they are imposed on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It prevents people, obviously, from getting the help they need if they want to get some help from their family, friends, or counselors. It also, like the one person said, you feel like you have to lie. If it's leaving a job, you've done nothing wrong, you were wronged. But then there you go, and you're being interviewed for a job or starting a new job, and you're feeling like you can't be honest about what happened or why you're no longer there and that sort of thing. So it is definitely a further punishment for the person who's suffered, for sure. So I'm going to turn this now over to a Q&A. And so we see a hand up already. So what we have is one person I think has a microphone. And then what we'll do is, you can raise your hand, and we'll have you ask the question. So I'm going to ask you. Obviously, we want to address the panel in a very respectful manner. So a friendly reminder, and we'll do this for about the next. I think we have about 20, 30 minutes or so. And we'll see if there's enough questions or any comments that people want to share. So I think there was a person up in the back there.
Yeah.
Yes.
I didn't know. Yeah, she's got one already.
Okay.
Okay. Sure.
All right.
You can go ahead.
Am I good to go?
Yes.
As some of you know, I've been a supporter of the campaign for some time, having hosted Julie. I think it was 2 years.
Very early days.
Yeah. But what has come to me right now, actually it came to me a little earlier, is some of the biggest, let's say the most common writers of contracts, the most common users of contracts are government. Mm-hmm. And I recently wrote a letter to our premier and a number of other folks, and I'm fairly certain, Sonia, that you were CC'd on it, but if you weren't, I'll make sure that you get it tomorrow. And it is about changing contractual practices, particularly with respect to Indigenous peoples in this instance. But it does come to my mind, having read the service plan for the Ministry of the Attorney General. There's a lot of talk about further enhancing the Civil Resolution Tribunal in this province. May we all hurl. Anyway, for whatever reason. That being said, they do a lot of settlements. So does the OIPC. So do employment standards. What kind of things are in their templates? And if their respondents are asking for NDAs, they are in the perfect position from both a policy perspective and a legislative one, should we get legislation. But on a policy level now, we could say, actually, no, you're shaking your head. You've already thought of this, haven't you?
Well, yes. But thank you, Martha. Really, really important point. We have come across many people in public government work who have been NDA'd, and that includes the federal government as well. Shocking use of NDAs actually to cover up racial discrimination and anti-Indigenous racism by governments. What Martha's referring to is the fact that these are being used, and I don't know, I can't speak for, I can't speak for the Civil Resolution Tribunal, but I do know that in every human rights commission in the country, they are being used constantly at a settlement level. So in other words, you bring your human rights claim, you have some kind of a discussion or mediation in advance of that. And those are processes that I, advocated for 20 years ago. They seem to be enlightened processes. But those processes, if they end in a settlement, include an NDA over and over and over again. I've spoken to most of the chairs of the human rights commissions on a provincial level. And so far, I've only been able to find one who recognizes that this is completely contrary to what their role is supposed to be, which is exposing human rights abuses. But I think that what the answer there basically, Martha, is that once there's legislation, it won't be possible. It doesn't make sense either. No, I know. Yeah. Right. But I think something that everybody has to understand about NDAs is there's a huge amount of this that doesn't make sense. Mm-hmm. Like you can actually drive yourself crazy trying to figure out why the party who wants this to be private and wants you to sign an NDA is threatening you with going to court where everything will be public. Like, duh. It's a massive bluff. And so, what you have to recognize is the power of NDAs, and that's what, I really hope you take away from listening to those testimonies, audios, and reading them on our website, is that they intimidate people and scare people who don't know that they're not obliged to follow them. I mean, the reality is there's no video camera in the room when you're telling your mom about something terrible that happened to you at work. But people are so afraid of losing whatever compensation they've got, so afraid of losing their jobs. And these are a classic example of the incredibly effective use of intimidation, even though so much of it is completely illogical.
I just want to reflect a little bit on public institutions, and I think about this a lot, and I use the term barnacled. This is what I've sort of observed since I became an MLA, that whatever public institution it is, whether it's MCFD or health authorities or government or any branch of government, there is this self-protective thing that is happening, and it gets more and more barnacled over years. So one of the things we're hearing a lot about is health authority employees who aren't allowed to say anything publicly that would put the health authority into harm or disrepute, right? Which is essentially, well, you can't say anything critical about this organization that you work for that is supposed to be serving the public. And if it's failing to serve the public, you should be speaking up about that as a member of a public service. And so I think there's a cultural thing here that is so critical that we reflect on. This keeps me awake at night. How do we reorient our public institutions and our public service back to the public and away from this continual reputation protection that exists in government, and that it exists because of, I think, partisanship has a problem here. Like whatever government, that's the branded government of whatever party's in government. So now you're protecting that party's brand, and this has to get undone. And the NDAs are a symptom of this cultural problem we have with our public institutions.
Hi there. Thank you. My name is Janelle O'Connor, and I practice exclusively in the area of civil sexual assault on behalf of survivors. So unfortunately, I deal with NDAs more than I would like to. I take them very seriously. I draft them very carefully, make sure my clients understand them, expand them as much as we can. Thankfully, institutional clients have largely been agreeing to waive them recently. But in fairness, in some cases, they are a tool for the survivor. They do offer leverage and allow us in certain cases to get a significant settlement very early on that sometimes is in the interest of the survivor, as according to their healthcare professionals. And I worry about how this could potentially impact that, or if, I'm sure you've all given this some thought. So I'm curious what you think about that. And I'm thinking about the cases where settlement is reached in advance of litigation, and not coming to the settlement means litigation will have to ensue.
Well, I mean, all of these are about settlement. Every single case we're talking about with an NDA is about settlement before litigation. I have yet to find someone who signed an NDA who didn't regret doing it. And I have literally talked to hundreds of people now and heard from a lot more than that. What people don't seem to understand and don't seem to be, and I'm sure this doesn't apply to you, so don't imagine I'm saying it to you, but what people constantly say, their lawyers, their plaintiff lawyers, as the victim, never told them, was that they could have a one-sided confidentiality agreement that protected just their privacy. And this whole idea that you have to promise to protect the other side in order to be protected yourself, I mean, it's just toxic to do that. And so it's very hard for me, and I've tried, believe me, hard to think of an example. The only time I can ever think of an example where it might be in the victim's interest to promise to protect the other side is in a very small community, when identifying that person inevitably identifies them. But those are, very small number of cases. We're talking about giving privacy to someone who needs it, but not or at the same time agreeing to protect the other side. And I mean, you say you think this gives you an earlier settlement. I mean, of course it does, because, there's less arguing about the NDA. And I know many people who we often suggest to people in the process of bargaining that they just push back. They just say no, because we know the other side doesn't want to go to court. And you know what happens? Those people get their settlements without NDAs in them all the time. but they really have to hang in there. That's the problem. And I think it would really help if plaintiff lawyers were aware of that, and also of the fact that if you look at the settlement figures, if you look at the quanta for settlements in this area, take sexual harassment, we have figures that are very consistent in the UK, in the US, in Canada, and just over 50% of these settlements are for $10,000 or less. I mean, we are not talking, I got $1 million settlement because I agreed to stay silent. I mean, that is an absolute fantasy that's fueled by some very bizarre lawyers who get a lot of airtime, because it just isn't true. It's just not part of the empirical data. So I would say, if we can make it clear to victims, their privacy can be protected, and just because their privacy is protected doesn't mean to say they have to give the same to the other side. I mean, were all these people asleep in contracts? I'm sorry, I taught contracts for a long time. Then, we don't need these NDAs, and they do far more harm than they ever do good.
Jennifer, yeah.
Yeah, I would also just comment that, nobody wants to go to a trial, right? So more than likely, the numbers are, something like 90%, 80% of cases settle. They don't go to trial. So usually, mind you, it can be years before you get there. And so it's hard, I know, on people who've experienced something traumatic to have to wait or to have that hanging over their head because it's constantly in their mind. But often you will get a settlement without an NDA. And do they really want to go to court where it's all going to be out in the open? Because then it's all out in the open. It's really the threat and the pressure on a complainant, and really I think the shaming that happens to them, and they don't want to live through that again, right? The re-victimization, which is a real thing and a real problem with our legal system right now, which is what happens to complainants in any situation. I'll also just say that I presented on NDAs at a human rights law conference in the fall, and I did an informal poll with Zoom. That's a good thing about that. So, and I asked how many people, because you always get this argument, oh no, people can get a lot more money than you would if you have an NDA. And I did a survey, and, most everybody, I think the number, almost nobody said they got what the tribunal would get in a settlement with an NDA. And I think, most people said they were around 60%, reasonable settlement possible. So you can settle and you don't need an NDA. And it's not like because an NDA is there that a complainant is getting a massive payout. You're getting more what you're entitled to. And remember that the payment is for the harm that's already done. Mm-hmm. You're supposed to get compensated for the harm. And in all cases, I think that if somebody would say that money doesn't put them, doesn't make up for the harm that's done. In sexual harassment, they've lost their job. They've lost some self-esteem. They may have mental health issues now. A little bit of money, no matter how much it is, does it really make up for that? I think most people say that it doesn't.
Yes, was there? Yeah, right here.
Thank you very much for sharing your knowledge in the film. Happy Women's New Year. I just call it New Year rather than Mother's Day, Father's Day, Mother's New Year. My question is, I'm an educator and I'm interested in the preventive side. And I'm a creator of Grandparents Film Festival, and I'm trying to change Victoria Day to Grandparents Day. Hopefully that happens during my lifetime. But my question is about the film. There was a girl who tells her mother about rape, and the mother is quite shocked. So my question is, when do children learn about the issue of rape? And especially I'm relating to grandparents again. Can grandparents and grandchildren talk about the issue of sexual abuse, what can be done, both for the grandchildren, male and female or all genders? And also my second question is about the university, because I taught in many universities, and I always wonder, the sexual abuse cases are there, but then the donors issue comes in, so the university tries to keep quiet. So can you comment on the two sides? What you are grandma, so congratulations. Maybe you can, and the rest of you can also talk about mother as what should the grandparents tell the grandchildren? Thank you.
That's an amazing question. Thank you. I have recently become a grandmother. I must say it's one of the most wonderful experiences of my life. You know, I think that this is a question that is very personal to every family, I should say right away. And I think that there are different traditions of how families deal culturally and amongst themselves with these types of issues. Because I'm a survivor of sexual abuse and rape and domestic violence, that has put me on a path to, as soon as I believe that my daughters, I have 3, were able to start to think about these issues, as young as the girl in the film, in fact, I would start to explain. And I would never do it with, with detail about what happened to me or anything like that. But I would say, Mum's had a lot of experiences, and these are some of the things you should start to be, aware of, and some of these things happen. And I would always answer questions. I will always, always answer their questions. I think that's really important as well. And just to say quickly about the university piece, every university in this country is using NDAs to cover up sexual misconduct and bullying and harassment. And that is, sometimes student to student, but mostly it is faculty member to student, as it was in the case that I became involved in. We've just got the law changed in Ontario on that. We got it changed in England right before Christmas, so that's made a huge difference. But I think there should be, if anyone here is from a university, a huge push in British Columbia to make your universities take the pledge. We have a pledge on the website for universities. Yes. And I think that needs to happen. We had 80-something universities in the UK take the pledge before the legislation happened. And they're still taking it, actually, because the legislation doesn't come into force yet. So I think that's something that you could definitely do here in British Columbia, and I would be delighted to help push that.
Joanne, can I just add one thing to that?
Yes, absolutely.
Just as a mom, and also I'm a teacher, I think the conversation with children and adolescents also needs to be very much around consent. Yeah. And what does that mean? And then listening to our, I've learned to be very mindful of my own daughter. I love her so much, and I'm a very cuddly person, but I wait for consent. Right. And I think that we have to be able to have young men and young women be very understanding and informed about, you need permission to touch other people. Right? And if you don't have that permission, then you shouldn't do it. And if you haven't given that permission, then nobody should be touching you without your permission. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's where we really need to do work. That this is just should be the baseline that we should expect. And I often think about, when we are speaking of our own generation's mistakes, go hug your uncle. I don't want to.
Yeah.
No, go hug your uncle. No, I don't want to. I don't want to hug him, right? So even that, telling our children to have physical contact with people that they don't want to have physical contact with, don't do that. Let's not do that.
Good advice for sure. We have another question there? Yes.
Thank you. As a very young man, I was sexually harassed by older men. And I was afraid to say anything. So it's men and women who are very reluctant to do that. And I was also really felt oppressed by a group when what I said was right. And I knew they were wrong. So I really admire Sonia's courage for doing that in the legislature. And Julie, when you said that it should not take courage to speak out, well, that certainly would be wonderful. But most people I know, men and women, are afraid to speak out. So here's a magic question for you. What would you do about that?
Yeah, I mean, what Zelda and I said that day was it should be normal. And we were looking ahead to a society that doesn't yet exist. So, you know, I think that's important to say. I'd like to live in a world where when somebody calls you and asks you, having asked all of your colleagues, all of whom refused to say anything, why did this person leave your university? I want it to be normal to say because they had spent 10 years harassing students and not for me to be the only one. I want it to be normal. It's forget brave. It's just, I want it to be normal. And I also just want to acknowledge your point that absolutely men, of course, are also targets of harassment and also feel a sense of shame. In fact, their sense of shame might be even more complex than we can imagine because, it's a shame that's related to a male identity, which I can't share. So how do we make all this normal? I really believe that the legislation that Sonia is bringing forward can become law in British Columbia if enough people get out there and say, this is really important. And that doesn't have to take particular bravery. I mean, it's going to take, half an hour to send the letter or the email or whatever. But I think that's what we can do to start moving this from it's exceptional when somebody speaks out to being normal when somebody speaks out. And I think that the same thing that happens with that happens with the sense of shame as well. I mean, I was ashamed to speak about my own sexual abuse and rape for almost 40 years, but I'm not now. And I think that if you can create an environment in which people know they'll be accepted, they know they'll be listened to. But at the moment, in our survey at the moment, we are told that almost 30% don't make a complaint about harassment or discrimination because they know they'll be asked to sign an NDA and they don't want to. I mean, that is insane, people. Think about this. Post Me Too, post Black Lives Matter, when we were supposed to be getting people, encourage them to be supported when you come forward and complain, and we're just shoving it all back under the rug again. So this is only one little part of that normalization, but it's an important part, a really important part.
I'll just also say that I think it's important in terms of trying to find people or to provide support, right? There's a lot of bystander training that's going on now, particularly related to racism and the swell of anti-Asian racism that's happening. But it applies also to sexual harassment or any type of bullying and harassment in the workplace. And I think that that's something I'd encourage people to look at and think about in terms of how people can be a better ally to be able to support people, make sure people are okay, follow up with them to see if they want to report or have some support in that. And I think an important thing to remember is, we want to try and find an explanation as to why these things happen, because a lot of these things, especially sexual assault, are so horrendous. Like, why is that happening? And then people start to question it. And people question themselves, and it relates to shame about what could I have done? Oh, I was trying to be nice. So was it my fault? Did I lead them on, right? We have to stop that, right? Because it's no one's fault if something's happening to you that you don't want to have happen, right? So,
Sonia? And one other thing I want to add, and Me Too and Black Lives Matter, and those were these big moments when people went together, right? We all put our voices in, and now we're in a different moment. And I was just at the Human Rights Commissioner's report yesterday, where the incidents of hate have been rising for the last 2 years. And, I think we can all feel that anecdotally. The data is now there. And in particular, I'm very concerned, and there was some of this in the film, about the hate and the violence that's being directed towards women who are in journalism, and the effort to silence women in journalism. It is the number of conversations just in the last week that I've had with journalists about this, and especially with male journalists who are desperate to, we have to talk about this, what's happening to my colleagues. And then again, women in political roles. And I think there's work we all have to do to make this unacceptable. That this is becoming normal. This is the wrong thing that's becoming normalized. Is this kind of violent, sexualized, violent rhetoric being directed at women in public roles? We need to stop that.
I think I'm mindful of the time. I think we have time for one more question.
Hi, my name is Anna, she, her. This gentleman brought up some issues that happen in colleges and universities, and it reminded me of something that happened while I was going to college. And something happened, and we graduated, and nothing was ever done about what happened. So I wonder if there's such thing as too late to speak now. Seems like time move on, and I think what happens a lot is that something happens, something seems to start to feel like someone is going to act, then nobody does, and then time goes on, and then nothing happens. So I wonder if there's such thing as, okay, it's too late now, Yeah.
So can I just ask you, is the person who was responsible for this still employed at this university or college?
He was not an employee. He was a student.
Another student. Okay. There's no statute of limitations on this. In other words, you can still go back there and say, I want you to do something about this. Now, the problem if it's another student is they don't have that much jurisdiction over that person any longer. I don't know what your actual, what your story is, obviously in detail, and I'm not asking you to say that publicly here. But if what it was, aside from the bad thing that was done by that person, was also an example of an institution just protecting itself and refusing to actually do anything, to act in a meaningful way, then absolutely, I think that can still be talked about. And I think that one of the things that unfortunately I have learned in 30 or so years of activism is that if the institution won't speak to you anymore, and they probably won't as soon as they realize it's a student who isn't there any longer, there are increasingly journalists who are interested in these stories, because it's important that we get out there, that institutions like universities, and there are many others, schools, hospitals, churches, are, as Sonia said earlier, protecting themselves all the time. Sorry? Sports, thank you. Yes, I mean, the list is endless. They are protecting themselves. And so, there is increasingly an appetite to write those stories, and that is really important. That there is, I felt that by the end, if there was an end, but, after the month or so of total media furore over Hockey Canada, which I have a lot of difficulty explaining to Zelda. It's important to people. Hockey's important to people in Canada. Really? That's important? Yes. There's lots of things we have to explain like that. But I think that what that showed was that if you hide something, if something bad happens and then you hide it or don't do anything about it, that is actually even worse than just fessing up to what happened in the first place. Do you understand what I mean? And so I think that matters increasingly for institutions. They're realizing that being told, even if it's years later, you really messed this up, you just protected yourself, that is starting to have a real sting. And that sting is very important. Yeah.
And I'll just say that if anyone has a personal issue that you want some legal advice for, Sharp Workplaces offers free legal advice, and you can call us and get some advice about your options and about what happened. And I would say that sometimes people, even if people are out of time because there are limitations to legal options, that sometimes there are other options, like the person wants to tell the employer. So, they're supported to write a letter or put it out and get it out there. So it depends. But please, there's some brochures and cards out in the foyer if people are interested to take. And you can take them and spread them around too, please.
Well, I want to thank the audience for the questions this afternoon, and I want to wrap up the afternoon by just giving the panelists 30 seconds or a minute to leave us with some final thoughts or messages. So, Jennifer, let's start with you.
I'm just so pleased to see that so many people came up and have such a great interest in this topic and this issue. This was actually the first time I saw the film, and it's amazing how powerful it was, even though I deal with these issues all the time. Like, to see it dramatized about how a person feels and going through it is really powerful. And I hope that everybody will join together and continue the fight.
Thank you, Jennifer. And Sonia?
Yeah, I still have my crying eyes from the film, so I have that, that feeling you have after you've cried a bit, and then you think, oh, what is that? But yeah, it was an incredible film and an incredible story. And Julie, I just want to really thank you for reaching out and for working alongside with us. I'm never happier than when I'm working on structural change and solutions. And so thank you for the gift of being able to work with you on that. And thank you for having me. And thank you to all of you for coming out today.
Julie, I'll end with you then.
Well, I just want to say a huge thank you to the incredible number of people who are helping us as volunteers now. Jennifer and Joanne have been doing incredible work. There are a number of other people in the audience. There's Shannon at the back there, Susan, Sherry. They're usually the ones in the T-shirts, but there are people all over the country now who are helping us. And that is wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful. The reality is that myself and Zelda are still working about 14-hour days doing this. And we really do need people who can possibly spare even a little bit of a few dollars to help by donating, because if we could just have a couple of people that we could pay to keep this ship floating all the time, it's basically been self-funded, and with the amazing efforts of the volunteers up to this point, that would really, really help. And thank you, everybody, for coming out today. And I'm so excited about the BC bill.
Me too. Thank you, everyone.